Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to the Keeping Children Safe 2020 Summit. This topic will be looking at child safeguarding Asia perspectives, and I am Vijay, Senior Child Safeguarding Advisor at Keeping Children Safe, and I'm based in Asia. There are three key topics that we'll be covering today. The very first topic that we'll be seeing is the regional instruments and mechanisms that promote child safeguarding. The second topic will be based on some of the key learnings and observations that we made from the region based on the work that we have done here. And the third one, based on the observations and learnings from the region, what are some of the considerations and recommendations that we would like to make for the organizations to strengthen the child safeguarding framework? Before I move on to the key topics, I wanted to show you three case studies from the region which has happened in the recent past and which talks about a lot of things about child safeguarding. So let's look at the first case. It's from India and it has happened in the year 2018, where many girls who were staying in a NGO or a shelter home were sexually abused and physically assaulted and abused by the NGO staff and people who are working in the organization. In the second case, it's from China, where a primary teacher was convicted and executed for raping 26 minor girls in a school in China, and it happened in the year 2015. In the last case, it comes from Malaysia, where in an NGO and welfare home, staff were accused of abusing children, and staff are being arrested in that particular case. And this happened very recently in May 2020. So the very fact which is getting highlighted in all these three case studies is the fact that child abuse happens in all kinds of organizations and in all settings. It doesn't happen only in non-governmental organizations. It happens in sports settings. It happens in educational settings. It happens in faith-based institutional settings. Name any kind of a setting which comes into contact with children. It happens in all settings, and it happens in all geographical regions. It doesn't happen only in a specific geographical region. For example, it doesn't happen only in Africa, or it doesn't happen only in Europe. It happens in all regions, and Asia is no exception on that case. So with that understanding, I wanted to move forward to the first session of this first topic of this session, where we'll be talking about some of the regional instruments that promotes child safeguarding. The objective and the rationale why we wanted to have this topic before we talk about other things is the fact that we do understand there are many organizations in the region who do a lot of lobbying and advocacy, not just at the national level, but they also do a lot of lobbying and advocacy on child rights and child protection at the regional level. So we wanted them to have a kind of understanding that there are a lot of regional instruments and mechanisms that also talks about child safeguarding either directly or indirectly. So they can use this information while they are doing an advocacy and lobbying at the national level and at the regional level, so that they can add to the government's knowledge about child safeguarding, so that the state child safeguarding system and policies can be strengthened not at the national level but also at the regional level when they are working at the regional level. So let's look at first South Asia. We have SARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and as part of the SARC, you also have a body called the South Asia Initiative to End Violence Against Children, which is a SARC apex body and which is also an intergovernmental body. So these two structures are very good structures at the regional level in Southeast Asia level to lobby for a lot of things in terms of strengthening the child protection systems, and also about policies that needs to be translated at the national level. For example, the document on South Asia Initiative to End Violence Against Children mentions that states, the nations, should have legislations to prohibit all forms of sexual abuse, exploitation, and harassment in all settings. So the key word is all settings. So when they say all settings, it also means not only in the communities, it also means in NGO sector, child, which is child safeguarding. It also talks about educational settings. It also talks about sports settings where children come into contact with children, with adults, or there could be a lot of vulnerability related to that. So when the word comes at all settings, so it also means a lot of things about not only about child protection, it also means about child safeguarding. Let's move on to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is even better, I would say. You have two specific declarations in the region, which is ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, which was declared in the year 2012. And then you have the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Children in the region, which was declared in the year 2013. So these two declarations have a very good mention about protecting children at the community level and at various settings, and to have a lot of policies which protect children. And there is also another structure at the regional level which provides a lot of insulation and a lot of protection for children, which is the ASEAN Commission on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Women and Children, ACWC, which was formed in the year 2010 as part of the ASEAN mechanism. So this could be a good structure where NGOs can lobby and advocate to strengthen the child safeguarding systems at the regional level. So let's see what is the declaration on the elimination of the violence against women and children in ASEAN that declaration mentioned. It clearly mentions that the government should integrate legislations, policies, and measures to prevent and eliminate violence against women and children. And it also talks about the need to strengthen the capacity of the stakeholders, and also to come up with child friendly legislations, policies, and measures for women and children, particularly the victims of violence, I would say survivors of violence. So there is a lot of mention about the governments to come up with legislations, policies, and measures, child friendly policies. So a lot of things can be used, and a lot of these information can go into the lobbying and advocacy efforts of this NGOs at the regional level. So with that understanding, I just wanted to move on to the key topic that we'll be discussing today. Keeping children safe has been doing a lot of work in the Asia region for more than a decade now, and we have worked with many organizations, not NGOs. We also worked with sports institutions. We have worked with educational institutions. We have worked with faith-based institutions. So working with these institutions and organizations and in different settings, we have come up with a lot of new learnings and new observations and areas for strengthening. So we just wanted to focus on those aspects here. And to do that and put it into perspective and to make it a little simple and more specific, I have divided into 6 thematic topics, so which we'll be looking at in detail as we move on in this presentation. The first one, child protection versus child safeguarding. The second one, policy versus practice. Third thematic area, accountability versus reality. Risk assessments and mitigations. The fifth one, designating child safeguarding focal points and leads. The last one, monitoring and governance. So these are the 6 thematic topics that I'm going to cover to take you all through the learnings and observations that we have made in the region, and to come up with the areas for strengthening. So let's look at the first topic that we'll be discussing. understanding child protection and child safeguarding. Like I mentioned, based on the work that we have done in the Asia region, the very first training and the primary learning and observation that we have made here is the fact that there is a lot of challenge and there is a lot of gaps in terms of understanding the difference between child protection and child safeguarding. Of course, it's only a thin line, but we do understand it becomes a great wall to understand between child protection and child safeguarding. We do understand there's a lot of possible cross-cutting situations and scenarios that could arise, which can be defined as even child protection, not child safeguarding, and sometimes it could be child safeguarding. It could also be defined as a child protection scenario. But there should be a clear understanding sometimes in most of the situations, which is very, very clear that it should be either child protection or whether it's a child safeguarding scenarios. So there is a gap and it's a gray area of, like when we're working on child safeguarding, the understanding should be very clear in terms of what is child protection and what is child safeguarding. And there is always in the Asia region, what I understand is there's a traditional understanding of the word child protection. So when we define the word child protection, it talks about various aspects, talking about preventive measures, you're talking about legislative aspects, talking about policies, talking about enforcement, talking about rehabilitation. So a lot of aspects goes into child protection. There is a lot of work that's been done in the region in terms of child protection. So maybe that could be the reason why many organizations feel the difficulty in understanding the word child protection and child safeguarding. Let me give you an example. In India, in 2018, the government came up with the draft National Child Protection Policy, which is the national draft National Child Safeguarding Policy. And there was a lot of consultations happening at the various levels at the national level in different regions within the country. And I got an opportunity to attend one of the consultations that happened in South India. And there were a lot of organizations which attended this consultation, and they were discussing about the draft national child protection policies. But most of the organizations, what they were sharing about the national draft national child protection policy, they were talking about the legislations, they were talking about the enforcement, they were talking about the funds that they require to do the child protection programs. So they were talking about a lot of things which is in a big picture and which is external to the organization, but actually they were not looking at from the internal looking aspect, which is the child safeguarding aspect. So they clearly couldn't understand that the government is putting the accountability back into the organization, to their own organization, to ensure children are safe within the NGO sector. They couldn't understand that, but they were thinking about more about the external things, like what are the issues happening at the community level, about the big picture of the laws and legislations, about the policies, about the enforcement and various other things. So that situation really created me a kind of an, gave me an idea that for any trainings that we do, there should be we need to start with a clear definition of what is the difference between child protection and child safeguarding. So this is one of the biggest learnings that I would say from that we got from the region. We need to really have a clear differentiate and have a clear understanding between what is child protection and child safeguarding. Second one, policy versus practice. So one of the key things that we always keep mentioning is having a robust policies and procedures alone may not help an organization to safeguard children. I'm sure like you all would agree on that fact that policies and procedures itself will not help an organization to safeguard children. But putting the commitments into action well, which means we wanted the organization to translate the policies and procedures into action, put it into implementation. So there are a lot of other commitments and practice needs to happen within an organization to make sure the policy is translated into practice. So which is one of the key learnings, I would say, because let me go on. I will explain to you in a little later. And one of the another learning is one size fits all kind of an approach. There are many organizations fail to contextualize the policies for their own organization. They take the policy from another organization and they just develop a policy for themselves because they wanted to have a policy in place. But what they lack to understand is the fact that what is required for for their own organization, based on what are the structures they have within their organization, based on their level of contact with children, based on the structure of the organization. So that is lacking because they take a policy maybe from the online, or maybe somebody has given them the policy, and then they just translate that policy into their own organization's policy. So they miss to like create a customized policy which is relevant and taking into consideration the local aspects, the local context, a policy for their own organization. And that's one of the aspect which is missing when they are developing a policy. The another one is how much children are involved in the process of developing a policy and in the implementation. Are children provided with space to provide their views and opinions when they are developing a policy for their own protection within the organization? How many organizations are giving them a space to do that? So that's one of the learnings what you have seen. But my experience is most of the organization don't do that, because the most of the policies, as far as I know, and based on our experience, is that most of the policies are developed by the senior management, not even sometimes consulting with the staff members, and by the board and by the senior management, and it's rolled out. And another aspect that needs to be considered is child safeguarding policy merely a tick box requirement because the donor or the funding agency or the foundation wants your organizations to have a child safeguarding policy? Is that the reason that the organization is developing a child safeguarding policy? Yes, to an extent, I would say yes, because that's what we see based on the experience working in the Asia regions. Because the donor or the funding agency wants the organization to develop a policy, so they develop a policy. Another interesting and I would say like it's a very bad like a pretext is that many organizations have multiple child protection policies or child safeguarding policy because of the reason they may have multiple donors and multiple funders for different programs. So each donor organization or a donor funding agency asks for a child safeguarding policy. So they develop child protection policy or a child safeguarding policy for that particular program. So there will be like 10 policies or 10 safeguarding policies for the same organization. So is that how it operates? Ideally, it should not be done that way. So that's one of our biggest learnings in this region. The last one is policy implementation aspects are not considered while budgeting. That becomes the biggest challenge because your child safeguarding policy has a lot of procedures that needs to be implemented, a lot of things that needs to be translated into practice, for example, trainings. But your budget does not allow for you to spend money to have these procedures to be put into practice and put into implementation. So that there is a kind of a gap in terms of policy versus practice. What's in the policy cannot be translated to practice because your budget does not allow such things to happen, and there's a lot of constraints. So that becomes one of the challenge, and that's one of our learnings. The next one is accountability versus reality. The prime objective of having a child safeguarding policy in place is the fact that the organization wants to be accountable to the children to whom they are working for. But for various reasons, when it puts into practice, when it goes to the reality, actually there is a lot of barriers and challenges that the organization face, and that needs to be taken into consideration. One of the things that maybe you would like to consider is awareness of the local child protection agencies on child safeguarding. That's one of the biggest challenges I see in this region. the awareness of the local child protection agencies, the police, or the social welfare, or the women and child, any department that we are talking about, even let's even talk about the legal structures, legal stakeholders. There is a lot of lack of awareness on child safeguarding, so they don't know how to respond and how to help the organization when a situation of child safeguarding comes in. So that is one of the biggest challenges I see in this region. The second one is the NGO bad if they report an incident to the local authorities? Because that's what is seen in this region. When a case is reported in an organization, it is seen as a bad organization because there is a child who has been physically abused or sexually abused. But there are a lot of factors that you need to consider, before even judging whether it's a good or a bad organization. If the organization has responded to the situation immediately, and if everything is done in a transparent way, then I think we cannot judge the organization as a bad organization, because they are trying to help the child to come out of the situation, and they are trying to take specific actions against the perpetrators, who could be a staff or senior management person. If they are doing it in a right way, definitely I think we should not be judging them as a bad organization, because they are trying to bring the issue out and to help the child in a more transparent way. Of course, if the organization is putting things under the carpet, and if they don't want to raise the issues, then of course I think then everything gets blowed out, and if the things are happening only because they can't handle the situation, then of course I think it could be a bad organization because they wanted to hide the issue, but it comes out eventually because of various factors and various reasons. Then it could be a bad organization because they don't want to be really transparent, and they are not acting in the best interest of the child. Moving on, lack of local procedures to address child safeguarding incidences in a sensitive and child focused manner. This is one of the biggest challenge in the region, because there is no a proper local procedures to handle child safeguarding concerns and incidences. Whether you take it as whether you take a police department or you take a social welfare department, there is not much clear procedures to address child safeguarding incidences and concerns, and that's one of the biggest challenges in the region. The last one is media. Of course, we all know media plays a big role in terms of bringing out the child protection incidences to the larger group of people, for them to understand what are the biggest challenges and why the such incidents are happening. But in most of the cases, what we've seen in the region is that there's a lot of insensitiveness in terms of media reporting, and there's a lot of hype when a case of child abuse is happening within an organization. It's been hyped. There are a lot of violations happening, and where a lot of violations done by the media, putting the photographs of the child, putting the name of the child. So there are a lot of things that disclose the like information about the child, which can put a child at a higher risk. So those kind of hype and insensitiveness is also done by the media, which is really a very bad thing in the region. Moving on to the next one, risk assessments and mitigation. So in terms of risk assessment and mitigation, it's a key prevention strategy to identify, mitigate, or reduce potential risk of harm and abuse. Risk assessment itself is a key prevention strategy, and if any organization is doing it in an effective way, I'm sure like many of the organizations should be able to reduce the level of risk of harm to the child. First, many organizations find it difficult to even understand what are the potential or perceived risk of abuse of risk of abuse for a child. And when they realize that they need to do that, then it becomes a rocket science, because not just because the risk assessment is a complex a way of doing it, not because of that, because they don't know how to go and find a potential risk of harm. because they really wanted to say the organization is good, and they think if the organization has a lot of risk for children, then the organization itself is bad, and that could be the perception of the outsiders. And so they don't want to say these are the risk of harm, a potential risk of harm for the children within the organization. So with that perception, when they start doing the risk assessment, it becomes a rocket science, and it becomes a very difficult process for the organization to do the risk assessments. And when they start doing the risk assessment, some of the organizations, so what I find is there's a challenge in terms of differentiating between what is physical safety, what is the personal hygiene, and what is the risk of abuse, because most of the organizations in their risk assessments get confused among these three things. Sometimes they keep mentioning about a lot of things about physical safety, infrastructure, the building safeties, and all those aspects. And sometimes some organizations talk a lot about personal hygiene. So all those things, of course, I don't want to say these are not required. I think this is also required, but potentially the high, another one of the major aspects that needs to be covered under the risk assessment is the potential risk of abuse or harm to the child within the organization, which can either come from the staff or by the design of your programs, or it could be because of the operations, your organization's operations. So this needs to come out clearly in the risk assessments. Unless you come up with this one, definitely the organization may not be able to prevent, first of all, to identify, and if you identify, to prevent such situations from happening. So these are some of the key learnings in terms of risk assessments and mitigation. Moving on, the next topic, designating child safeguarding focal points and leads. The one question that I wanted to ask here before we go ahead and further discussion is your executive director, country director, or the director the designated safeguarding focal point by default? Should they be the designated safeguarding focal point by default? I don't think so. Not always, not in all situations. There are various factors that any organization needs to consider before designating child safeguarding focal points. For example, the size of your organization. Any organization which is bigger than 20 staff should not be having just one focal points or a focal lead person, safeguarding lead within the organization. Geographical area covered. If your organization is working in a small geographical area, or is your organization working in different regions within the country, or is it an international office which has a lot of offices at the global level and different countries? So there are a lot of factors that you need to consider before designating the child safeguarding focal points. And the last and the key thing that any organization needs to remember is the level of interaction with children. What is the level of interaction of the designated focal person or the leads with children? If the designated focal points level of interaction with children is very, very, very low, and how are we expecting the children to have a trust to even disclose if something is happening to them and if they wanted to ask for help? For example, an organization working at the national level or at the state levels, if they wanted to designate a person, only the executive director, and the executive director, like does not work in the field level, and the children, if there is any kind of a issue that the children face at the field level, how are we expecting the children who don't have any kind of interaction with the executive director to raise a safeguarding issue with that executive director? What kind of a trust the child may have, or what kind of a communication channels are we expecting the child to raise the safeguarding concerns with the executive directors? Then it may not even happen. So that is a very, very key thing that any organization needs to consider. What's the level of interaction of the designated focal points with the child? What's the level of trust the children may have with that person? One of the things that we also wanted to consider is that designating focal points at various levels within the organization, not just at the senior management level, but you may designate somebody at the mid management level, like a program manager or a program coordinator, And you can also have somebody at the entry level, could be a field officer, could be your community teacher, someone from your community level who works with the children, who comes into contact with children, who has a very good rapport with the children, and who the children trust, basically. The last one is the monitoring and governance. We see a lot of challenges in differentiating between what does it mean by having a policy and implementing it, and of measuring its effectiveness. So there are three things: having a policy, implementing it, and third one is measuring its effectiveness. These three things needs to happen in randomly, like together, hand in hand. And what we see in the region is there is no structured mechanisms and tools to monitor the policy implementation. First, many organizations lack mechanisms. They don't have a monitoring and evaluating mechanisms. They don't have a review mechanisms within the organization to review the policy in a periodic manner. The second one is tools, monitoring tools. There is no specific monitoring tools that they have within the organizations. Of course, I won't say all organizations. There are very organization which has a very good tools for monitoring, tracking the safeguarding concerns and everything. So few organization has that one. But there are a lot of organizations who face this challenge in terms of creating mechanisms, in terms of creating tools to monitoring the policy implementation. So that is one of the learnings and observations that we have made in this region. The last one is a lack of understanding on child safeguarding and support from the governance team, from the board, from the trustees of the organization. Because the trustees and the board members feel they are not, like working with the organization on a day-to-day basis, they don't. They think sometimes they don't need to know about child safeguarding, and they don't know how to support the organization, and that becomes one of the challenges because most of the things for the organization, policy level decisions, are taken by the governance team, and if they lack understanding on child safeguarding, so then it becomes a very tricky thing for the organization to get support from them and to get required attention from the governance team on that aspects. So these are the six thematic learnings that we have had from this region. So based on these six thematic topics and the learnings and observations, so we are trying to provide some considerations and recommendations. Considerations are something like a wish list that we wanted to have the organization, and recommendations are some aspects that the organization should have in place or should put in place. So some other considerations that we would like you to consider for your organization or for your grantees is that you could consider renaming child protection policy to child safeguarding policy. Like I mentioned before, it's ideal to have differentiating between the child protection and child safeguarding. So it is best if your organization, in case if it's called as a child protection policy, maybe in the future you may try to rename it as a child safeguarding policies, so that the organization as well as the staff and employees and everyone within the organization has a clear understanding between child protection and differentiate between child protection and child safeguarding. So for that reasons, it's not just about the language. Second one, your organization can consider creating awareness on child safeguarding among the local child protection agencies and stakeholders like police, lawyers, or media, medicos, or lawyers, anyone. So that could be one of the things that can help your organization if there is any kind of a concern that's coming up, so that they can help you in an effective manner. Your organization may also consider assisting the stakeholders, the local stakeholders, to develop a standard operating procedures for reporting and responding to safeguarding incidences, so that that can help not just your organization, but it can also help all organizations working with children in that particular state or at the national level. or at the regional level sometimes. So this can also be done by your organizations. Your organization may also wish to consider commissioning child safeguarding audits by external experts. Ideally, we recommend external audits every 3 to 4 years. So these audits can help your organization to understand your implementation aspects, understand what are the gaps, what are the best practices that's existing within the organization, and ideally it will help you to strengthen the child safeguarding practice and implementation within the organization. And if it's done by the external agency, then you are getting an external view, a perception from the external person, external consultant. So that would be one of the things that your organization can consider doing it in the future. Again, we are mentioning this is only a wish list, so this is not a must thing to happen. Moving on, these are some of the recommendations that we would like to provide for your organization, and these are something that your organization should have in place. So your organization should include budget heads for child safeguarding activities, for example, training or safeguarding audits, or the survivor support that is required, any kind of a budget heads that you would like to require for child safeguarding implementation. So that needs to be done. Your organization should provide a periodic training for all employees and volunteers on child safeguarding. Of course, ideally, an annual training for all the employees and volunteers is done by most of the organizations in the region. But one of the difficulties or one of the challenges that they face is, they end up doing a very common child protection training and not a child safeguarding training. So the organization need to consider doing a child safeguarding training for all the staff and not just child protection training. Of course, child protection training is required, but sometimes in most situations child safeguarding should also be included as part of the annual trainings, and thus should be a very exclusive training for the staff and volunteers on child safeguarding. Your organization should also consider providing opportunity for specialized training on child safeguarding for designated safeguarding focal points and leads. Apart from the annual training, which is a very common training which is happening for all the staff and all the employees and volunteers, your organization should also consider providing periodic trainings, a specialized training on child safeguarding by externals for the designated focal points, so that they can enhance their knowledge and understanding on child safeguarding, and they can transfer the knowledge within the organization, which can really help your organization to strengthen the child safeguarding practice and implementation. Your organization should also consider designating focal points at various levels within the organization, like I mentioned before, not just designating someone at the senior top management level, but also designating focal points at various levels within the organization. Your organization should also consider designating a board member or a trustee as a child safeguarding chair within the organization, so that they can take a lead at the governance level in terms of talking about child safeguarding in all the meetings, taking policy level decisions, and providing technical support to the overall organization as well as the top management about child safeguarding. So those kind of things should also be considered. Your organization should also undertake annual internal audit on child safeguarding. Unlike the external audit, this is an internal audit which should be done every year. This is not an option. This should be done so that you can identify where are the gaps and what are the learnings and internally. So this is will be effective at the internal level. Your organization should consider undertaking local mapping exercise to map the legal provisions and procedures that your organization should be following when there is an incidence of child safeguarding happening within the organization. So that will help your organization when something goes wrong within the organization. What are some of the legal provisions? What are the procedures that needs to be followed So that needs to be done by the organization. And finally, your organization should consider creating space for children to share their views and opinions on the policy and its implementation. Like I mentioned before, your organization may also consider involving children when you are developing the policy or when you're reviewing the policy, when you're doing periodic review. So you can give a space for the children to have a look at the policies and to see whether there are any areas for development, so improvement. So those could also be done. And in terms of implementation, you can provide opportunities for children to be on the committees, the child safeguarding committees, and to attend the committee meetings or staff meetings and to provide their views. So there could be a lot of spaces that can be created for children to share their views and opinions in terms of the policies as well as the implementation aspects, so that the overall child safeguarding system can be strengthened within the organization. So with that, we'd like to close this session today. Thank you for being here. And if there is any questions, definitely we would like to address it, and we'd like to share our views on your questions. So thank you very much again. Thank you so much for being here.